had memorized every single word I planned to say. For 3 consecutive nights, I stood in front of my mirror at 12:30 in the morning, keeping my voice down to a whisper so the estate staff would not catch a sound through the plaster. I went over the lines while putting away clothes I was no longer expected to touch, simply because I now had a team of people hired to do exactly that. I repeated the speech in the tub, out on the grounds, and stuck in the back seat of the SUV, while Enzo drove me to the drugstore in total silence for 20 minutes. That quiet was standard, of course, since conversation in this place only happened when absolutely required. I am letting you go, Julian. That is all this means. I am letting you go. The documents rested inside a beige envelope, perfectly printed and officially binding. I had discreetly acquired them from a lawyer on the outskirts of town, a man whose business card I had discovered hidden deep in my late father's office. I kept it a total secret. I even used an old coin-operated public phone to make the call. They were rare these days, but my education over the past 13 months had taught me to find them. Living on the margins of Julian Falcone's empire meant figuring out how to make your words vanish before they could be weaponized against you. That dark education was exactly what broke my spirit, the gradual, suffocating realization of what surviving in this environment actually required. Now, it was 11:42 on a Thursday night, and I was pacing down the grand hallway of the Falcone property. I held the envelope tightly against my heart with both hands, clutching it as if the pages might suddenly try to run away. The house was enormous and mostly dark at this hour. Marble floors, ceilings so high the chandeliers hung in shadow. It had never felt like mine, not once in 13 months, and I had stopped trying to make it so around month 4, when I finally understood that this marriage was a transaction, and transactions did not require nesting. Light bled under the study door. He was always there late. I did not know everything he did in that room. I had learned not to ask questions I did not want answered, but I knew it involved calls that lasted hours, documents that traveled by private courier, and men who arrived in expensive suits and left looking slightly smaller than when they had arrived. Julian Falcone had a way of making rooms feel like they had been waiting for him specifically, like the dimensions of any given space quietly rearranged themselves to accommodate the gravity of him. I knocked twice, not because I was being polite, because I was giving myself 2 more seconds to turn around. "Come in." His voice was the same at midnight as it was at noon, even unhurried, like everything that mattered had already been accounted for and time was just a formality. I opened the door. He was at the desk, dark wood, enormous, covered in papers that he managed to make look organized. He had his jacket off, hanging on the back of his chair, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark hair, silver just beginning at his temples, sharp jaw, eyes that were a specific shade of gray that I had never seen on another human being. The kind of gray that happened in skies before bad weather. He looked up when I entered, and his expression did not change because it never changed. But something in those eyes did. A slight adjustment, attention fully given, Clara. Not a question, not surprise, just my name placed down like a card. I stopped, my rehearsal evaporated. "I have something for you." I walked to the desk. My heels were quiet on the Persian rug. I set the envelope down in front of him and stepped back like I had handed him a lit match and needed the distance. He looked at it, then at me. Then he picked it up, and I watched his hands, careful, precise hands, the kind of hands that had done things I preferred not to know about, as he opened the flap and slid the papers out. He read the whole thing, every page, every legal clause, every carefully worded statement about the dissolution of our marriage. I had expected him to stop at the first paragraph, to look up, to say something. He did not. He turned each page slowly and read, and I stood with my arms wrapped around my own waist and watched him. And the silence in that room was the loudest thing I had experienced in 13 months. "I had them prepared by someone independent," I said because I could not stand the quiet anymore. I didn't include anything about assets. I don't want anything. I left the financial section blank because I don't think that's right. I'm not trying to. I stopped, started again. "I just thought it was time for you. I thought you deserved to, I don't know, to have things be easier." He turned the last page. He set it down flat on the desk. He looked at me for a long, terrible moment that I could not interpret, and I felt myself filling with the specific anxiety of someone who has just confessed something and is waiting to find out whether it was received as gift or grenade. Then he picked up the papers and he tore them, not furiously, not with rage. He tore them the way you would tear something you had already decided on with deliberate measured force. And the sound, that clean ripping sound, went through me like cold water. He tore them in half, then quarters. He set the pieces on the edge of his desk like they were something that no longer required his attention. Then he stood. He came around the desk. I did not move. I do not think my body remembered how, and he stopped in front of me, closer than he had been in months. He was tall, and I had to look up, and I could smell the faint trace of the evening still on him. Something dark and expensive. He did not say anything. He reached up slowly, and put one hand at the back of my head, and he pulled me forward, and he held me against his chest with the kind of steadiness that I had been pretending I did not need for 13 months. My hands were caught between us, still folded. I did not know what to do with them. Julian, don't. His voice was quiet even still, but there was something underneath it, something pressed down and controlled that I had never heard before. Don't explain it again. I didn't. We stood there in the middle of his study, with the pieces of my papers on the corner of his desk, and I could hear my own heartbeat, and I could feel his through his shirt, and neither of us moved for a very long time. I did not understand it. I did not understand any of it. I had walked into that room trying to set him free, and somehow he had made me feel like I was the one who had just been uncaged. I thought about pulling back. I thought about saying something practical, something that would return us to the careful distance we had maintained. But his hand was warm at the back of my head, and the room was quiet, and I was very, very tired of all the pretending. So, I stayed. For the first time in 13 months, I just stayed. My father was a man who believed in handshakes. He believed that a man's word given clearly and witnessed by the air between two people was more binding than any document. He told me this when I was 7, when I was 12, when I was 19, and leaving for university. He believed it with the kind of certainty that made it sound like gospel, and not, as I eventually understood, the quiet philosophy of a man who had shaken hands with the wrong people and was slowly being swallowed by it. His name was Arthur Vance. He had run a mid-level import business out of a converted warehouse in the Port District. Shipping manifests, customs brokers, a small network of trucks and drivers and logistics men he had since he was young. For most of my childhood, it was enough. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't afraid. The house was warm. There was always food. He took me to the cinema on Sundays. What I didn't know until he was already sick. When the hospital had become our second home, and the doctor spoke to me in the hallway because he couldn't hear their honesty, was that the import business had been absorbing money that didn't belong to him for years. Not stolen, exactly. Borrowed, he called it once in a morphine-soft moment when his guard had come down. I borrowed, Clara. I always meant to return it. The people he had borrowed from were the Falcone family. Not borrowed by the time I understood the full picture, owed 3 years of growing debt and missed installments, and favors done in exchange for patience. By the time my father died, 4 months after the diagnosis, faster than anyone expected, the number attached to our family name was substantial enough that it had a physical weight. I was 23 years old, and I had a degree in graphic design, and a small portfolio of work, and a flat in the city I had been renting for 11 months. And I received a phone call from a man who told me very politely that he represented certain interests, and that there was a matter that required my attention. I almost ignored it. I didn't because something in his tone reminded me of my father, not of the man he was at his best, but of the man he became in those last months, when he looked at me with an apology in his eyes that he never quite said out loud. The meeting was held in a private dining room of a restaurant I would never have gone to on my own. There were 2 men at the table when I arrived. One I would come to know as Rocco, Julian's second, a compact man with a pleasant face and unpleasant eyes. The other was Julian Falcone himself. I had not expected him to be there. I had not expected him to be what he was. I had formed a vague image during the drive over, older, softer, the kind of man who accumulated debts at a distance and collected them through intermediaries. The man who stood when I entered the room was none of that. He was 31 then, composed and quietly watchful, and the restaurant seemed to understand that he was the most significant thing in it. He explained the situation with the directness of someone who considered dishonesty a waste of time. The debt, the options. None of the options were good. And then he said that there was a fourth possibility, one he was offering not as a demand, but as a practical arrangement, marriage. He needed a wife, not for love. He made that clear without making it unkind. He needed a legal, social wife for reasons that existed in the gray territory between business and politics. A counterweight to certain pressures being applied to his family's position. He wanted someone not from his world, someone clean, as he put it, in a way that was not demeaning, but was painfully precise. The debt would be dissolved. I would have security. I would have his protection. The arrangement could be revisited in 2 years if either of us desired otherwise. I said no. I drove home and sat in my small flat and cried for an hour. Then I thought about the alternative. I thought about what 3 men in the hallway of the hospital had said to my father when they thought I wasn't listening. I thought about the word collected and what it meant in a language where hands shook to seal the wrong kind of deal. I called the number they had left. The wedding was small and legal, and happened on a gray morning in November, 13 months before I walked into his study with those papers. There were no flowers. There was a brief lunch at the restaurant where we had first met, attended by Rocco and one of Julian's aunts, who patted my hand and said nothing. I wore a cream dress I had bought from a department store rack. Julian wore a dark suit and was impeccably composed throughout, which I appreciated because if he had been kind, I might have actually broken down. And then I moved into the estate, and the careful distance began. He was not cruel. That was the thing that complicated my understanding of everything. He was not cold, exactly. Cold implied indifference, and Julian was never indifferent. He was contained. He was present in the house, but occupied in a way that left little room for anything that wasn't essential. He had his world, and it was enormous and demanding and dangerous. And I had mine, which consisted of the East Wing guest suite, a studio he had set up for my design work, a garden I walked in when the anxiety got too big for walls, and the slow, painful education of learning to live beside someone without knowing them. He always knew where I was, not intrusively. I wouldn't find out until later exactly how he managed this. But there was never a moment in those 13 months when something in his attention wasn't turned in my direction. I just didn't understand it then. I thought it was management. I thought it was the careful administration of his investment. I thought I was a problem that had been solved and filed. The night I brought him those papers, I had been thinking about his freedom for 3 weeks. I had watched him in a conversation with a man named Mancuso, a political contact, large hands, small eyes, the kind of man who laughed to fill rooms. And Mancuso had said something about domestic complications and looked directly at me. And something had moved across Julian's face that I had never seen before. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, something that looked briefly like pain. I had decided, then I had borrowed his name and worn his ring, and lived inside the protection of his world for 13 months, without contributing anything, and the least I could do was give him back. The option to have a life that wasn't weighted by my presence, a real life, whatever that looked like for a man like him. I hadn't accounted for him tearing the papers apart. I hadn't accounted for the way his hand felt at the back of my head, or the way I'd had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from making any sound at all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest suite, my room, still the guest suite after 13 months. And I stared at the ceiling, and I tried very hard to understand what had changed and what it meant, and whether I was a fool for feeling something warm, where I had spent an entire year cultivating careful emptiness. I decided I probably was. I decided I should be more careful. I decided this at 3 a.m, and by 4 I had completely failed at it, and I lay there in the dark with his heartbeat still remembered in my sternum, and I was afraid not of him, of what I was becoming quietly in this house, with its marble floors, and its silences and its man at the center, who had just torn apart the only exit I had built. The next morning arrived with the indifference of weather. I dressed carefully. I had learned early that in this house being seen mattered in ways I didn't fully control, so I tried to appear composed even when I wasn't, which was most of the time. Gray trousers, a pale blouse, hair pulled back. I looked in the mirror like someone attempting to take up as little space as possible while still technically existing. Breakfast was usually solitary for me. Julian was gone early and back late, and the kitchen staff were professional and warm in a distant way, and I ate my toast and my coffee at the small table by the garden window, and read or scrolled my phone, or simply watched the morning happen. It was a routine I had made my own through repetition, and the quiet persistence of someone who had no better option. But when I came downstairs that morning, Julian was still there. He was at the long dining table, documents spread around him, a second coffee halfway through. He looked up when I entered. He did not say good morning. He watched me cross to the kitchen doorway, watched me come back with my coffee, and then he pulled out the chair to his left, not across from him, to his left, which was proximity he had never offered before, and said nothing, which was somehow louder than an invitation. I sat. We ate in silence. His silence, though, felt different from the silence of every other morning. It wasn't the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was in something else, something with weight in it, texture, like a room that has just held an argument and not yet aired. At 7:45, Rocco arrived. He came through the side entrance the way he always did with two other men behind him. Faces I recognized by now, Enzo and a younger one named Gino, and he stopped when he saw me at the table, and his expression did the very specific thing it always did when I was present. A contained professional neutrality that told me nothing. "Morning," Rocco said. "We have the Sever situation," Julian said, which was apparently enough of a response. He gathered his papers, stood, and then he looked at me. "Stay in the house today, Clara. Not a request, not an explanation, a fact." Placed calmly, I was going to the studio. I meant the small design office I had started renting on the far side of the city, 3 hours a week. A tiny threading of my old life into the new one. Not today. He picked up his coffee, drained it, and followed Rocco toward the east corridor, and the three of them disappeared in the direction of the private meeting room. And the door closed, and I was alone at the long table with a piece of toast, and a very sudden, very complete awareness that I had been told. I sat with the feeling for a while, trying to untangle whether it made me angry or something else. It made me something else that was worse. An hour later, I was in my studio space in the estate. Not the outside office, the private one he had fitted for me, which I used on the days I wasn't permitted, the external one when I heard the voices. The meeting room shared a wall with the corridor that ran behind my studio. I had not known this for the first 4 months. I had discovered it by accident on a night when I couldn't sleep, and walked the house at 2 a.m, and heard a voice coming through the plaster that made me press myself flat against the wall and stop breathing. I didn't listen in on purpose, but the wall was thin and the voices were not quiet. And when you have been living in a house of careful silence for over a year, sound carries, meaning the way water carries cold. Rocco was speaking. "The Rossetti people were at the port last night, 3rd time this month. They're not buying. I know if they're moving on the Sever contracts. They're not moving on the contracts." Julian's voice even. I could picture him standing at the window that faced the rear garden, which is where he always stood in that room. "They're moving on something else." A pause. "The girl," Rocco said carefully. "Clara, silence. They've been watching the estate perimeter twice a week for 6 weeks," Rocco continued. "The external drop points are inconsistent. They know about the marriage. Everyone knows about the marriage. They know she's not from our world, that she has no protection of her own." Another pause, longer. The kind that preceded decisions. "Double the East Gate rotation," Julian said. "And I want to know who Rossetti is speaking to inside the city, Julian." Rocco's voice was the same careful neutral it always was, but there was something underneath it. "If they're using her as leverage, if that's what they're building toward, you need to make a decision about exposure." The silence that followed was the longest one. "I've already made it," Julian said. I didn't hear anything else. I stepped back from the wall and sat down on my studio floor, which I had never done before. I sat there for quite a long time with my back against the wall, and my knees pulled up and my design tablet forgotten on the table, and I understood several things in quick, cold succession. The first thing I understood was that I was in danger. Not the theoretical kind I had been keeping at the edges of my awareness for 13 months, the specific named organized kind. There was a family called the Rossettis, and they were watching me, and they had been doing it for 6 weeks, and I had not known. The second thing I understood was that Julian had known. The third thing, and this one took the longest to settle, this one I turned over and over on that studio floor, like a sister. I wasn't sure I wanted to look underneath, was that he had already made a decision about me, about keeping me, and he had made it before I walked into his study, with those papers. Before the envelope, before the tearing, I had thought I was setting him free. He had already decided I wasn't going anywhere. I pressed my palms flat against the cold floor and tried to breathe slowly and thought, "You should be angry about this. You should be furious. You should feel trapped." I waited for the anger. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more confusing and entirely unwelcome. And I sat with it on the floor of my studio for the better part of an hour before I trusted my legs enough to stand up again. The message arrived on a Tuesday. I found it slipped under the garden gate, not the main entrance gate, the small iron one, at the back of the property that opened onto the service lane, the one I used on mornings when I walked the perimeter for air. The envelope was cream-colored, plain, my name written on the front in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Clara, not Mrs. Falcone, not a formal address, just my first name written by someone who knew me as a person and not a position. I stood in the garden with the morning still soft around me, dew on the hedges, the smell of someone's breakfast coming from the kitchen, and I looked at that envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single card printed, not handwritten. The text was brief. You married a dangerous man. You don't have to stay. We can help you leave safely, quietly, with your life intact. Think about it. When you're ready, leave a white handkerchief on the east garden fence before noon on any given Thursday. No signature, no contact information. Just that clean, confident, patient, the card of people who had done this before and knew how to make a door look open. I stood there and read it 3 times, and then I lied it back into the envelope and put it in the pocket of my cardigan and walked back inside and sat in my studio and shook. Not from fear of the card. That came later. I shook because of how immediately I had thought I should show this to Julian. Not I should take this seriously. Not this is my exit finally. Not someone is offering help. My first thought had been him, wanting to give it to him. And that told me something about the past 13 months. That I had been very carefully not admitting to myself. I didn't show him the card that day. I didn't know why exactly. Partly because I needed to think. Partly because the card had a logic to it. You married a dangerous man that I couldn't simply dismiss. I had married a dangerous man. I knew that. I had known it on the morning in November when I signed my name next to his and thought, "What have you done, Clara Vance?" But I had also on the floor of my studio understood something about the way he'd said I've already made it, and I was trying to figure out what those 2 things meant when placed together. I spent the week living with the card in my cardigan pocket. It traveled with me the way guilt travels, present and quiet, and occasionally taking up too much room. On Friday, Julian found me in the east garden after dinner. He came through the side door and crossed the lawn in that unhurried way he had, hands in his trouser pockets, and he stopped beside the bench where I was sitting with my knees together, and my hands in my lap, and the card in my pocket, and a feeling like every wrong choice I had ever made was queuing politely to announce itself. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm often quiet." I looked at him. The evening light made his eyes darker than usual, more charcoal than silver. "Not this quiet," I almost told him. The card was right there, a fold of paper, nothing, and I almost reached into my pocket and handed it over, and let him do whatever he did with threats, because he was clearly better equipped than I was. Instead, I said, I was thinking about my father, which was also true. So it was only half a lie which I told myself as I watched something in his expression open briefly and then close. What about him? Whether he knew. I looked at my hands. What he was doing when he started. Whether he understood where it led. A pause. He sat down beside me on the bench, which he had never done before, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off him in the cooling air. "He knew enough," Julian said, quiet, not unkind. "Men like your father, they always know enough. It's the rest of it they find ways not to see." That sounds like a criticism. It's not, it's just what it was. He looked at the garden. He was trying to protect you. He just ran out of road before he could. I didn't speak for a moment. "And you?" I asked. "Are you trying to protect me?" He turned to look at me slow, and that look, unhurried, complete. Like he had all the time in existence and was choosing to spend it on my face. Undid about 6 weeks of careful construction inside my chest. "Yes," he said. No elaboration. No warmth or chill in it. Just the word placed down the way he placed everything like a fact that had already been settled and did not require commentary. I nodded. I looked back at the garden. I thought about the white handkerchief in the cream envelope and the door that someone was holding open. I thought about what it meant to trust someone, in a world where trust was the most expensive currency. I didn't take out the card, but I should have. I should have taken it out right then on that bench, in that quiet evening, while he was sitting close enough that our arms were almost touching. I should have put it in his hand and let him read it, and let him handle it, because that was what he did. He handled the things that tried to harm me carefully, completely before they could grow. I didn't. I left it in my pocket, and that mistake would cost us both before it was over. He told me we were leaving on a Sunday evening. No warning, no extended explanation. Rocco was in the hallway when I came downstairs, and there were bags, my bags already packed by someone, which startled me, lined up beside the front door. And Julian came out of the study with his coat on and said, "We're going to the Blackwood property, tonight." "For how long?" "As long as necessary." I opened my mouth. "Pack anything from the studio you need." He looked at me steadily. "We leave in an hour." Rocco drove us in a car that was not the usual car, larger, darker, windows tinted to opacity. There was a second vehicle behind us that I couldn't see clearly. Gino was in the front. No one explained anything, and I sat beside Julian in the back and watched the city give way to motorway, give way to countryside, and tried to talk myself into asking what was happening. "The Rossettas made a move," Julian said at mile 14, unprompted. I went very still. Nothing direct, he continued. But direct enough that I want you off-site. He looked forward, not at me. The Blackwood property is outside their operational network. Smaller footprint, easier to manage. What kind of move? A beat. The kind that requires us to change arrangements. I thought of the card in my old cardigan pocket, left behind, now in the room I had packed in 40 minutes. I thought about the neat, careful text. We can help you leave. I thought about how the Rossettis, whoever they were, had known my name was just Clara. How long have you known they were watching me? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Since they started. That was 6 weeks ago. Yes, I turned to look at him. In the dark of the car, his profile was cut from something severe, jaw and cheekbone, and the line of his throat composed and forward-facing. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? He turned to look at me then, and in the darkness of the moving car, something crossed his face that wasn't his usual composure. It was something more careful than that, something that had been considered at length before being carried. Because I didn't want you afraid without reason, he said, and because knowing wouldn't have changed what you could do. I could have been careful. You're not trained for this kind of careful. That should have made me angry. The condescension of it, the quiet assumption that I was too small for my own information. And maybe it did make me angry, a thin, clean thread of it beneath the other things. But the other things were louder, and one of them was this. He had been watching a threat build for 6 weeks and had said nothing to me because he did not want me afraid, and I didn't entirely know what to do with that. The Blackwood property was 2 hours outside the city. It announced itself through a long iron gate and a private road lined with old trees, and when it came into view, it was a low stone manor house, smaller than the estate, darker in color, surrounded by grounds that fell away toward a lake on 3 sides. It looked like the kind of house that had been built with privacy as its primary architectural principle. Rocco and Gino made a sweep of the building before we went inside. Standing in the drive with the night air cool and the smell of water on it, I watched Julian watch them move, and I understood for the first time in a way that my body understood, rather than just my mind, the calculation of it, the constant assessment of space and risk and position. He stood with me behind him, not quite touching, one hand loose at his side, and he watched the building like it might rearrange itself without permission. Inside, the property was spare but warm. Someone had prepared it. Fires lit in 2 rooms, food in the kitchen, clean sheets on the beds. There were 3 bedrooms. Rocco and Gino took the 2 closest to the entrance. Julian showed me the 3rd. It was at the end of the upstairs corridor, large windows overlooking the lake, a writing desk, a bed with heavy linens. He put my bag on the chair. He opened the window an inch because I had told him once early on that I couldn't sleep in sealed rooms, and the fact that he had remembered and acted on it without being asked made me press my nails into my palm. The locks on the windows are bolted from inside, he said. Don't open them past this point. Okay. He moved toward the door. Julian, he stopped. I didn't know why I'd said it. I turned it over for a second, the reason I'd reached for his name, and found something I wasn't ready to examine closely. Is Rocco staying both nights? Something flickered. Yes, and you'll be here. You're not leaving again for the city. Another pause. Longer. I'm not leaving, he said. I'll be at the end of the hall. I nodded, looked at the window. Good. Good, I said quietly, which was more honest than I'd intended. He left. I heard his footsteps down the hall, unhurried as everything he did, and I sat on the bed in the spare stone room, with the lake visible in darkness beyond the glass, and tried to have a measured, rational relationship with the fact that I was glad he was staying. In the days that followed, we existed at a reduced distance. There was nowhere to retreat to in the Blackwood house. No long corridors, no separate wings. We ate at the same small table because there was only one table. We walked the grounds in the mornings, first separately, then by the 3rd day together, which happened without discussion, which was how most of the important things happened between us. He pointed out the names of trees he knew from his childhood summers in the countryside, which was such an unexpectedly ordinary thing that I'd had to look away. He asked me once what I'd been working on in my studio before the move, and I told him about the brand project I'd been developing, a small music label, nothing significant, and he listened the way he did everything completely without interruption, and asked 2 questions that were intelligent enough to embarrass me, because I hadn't expected intelligence there. Hadn't expected interest. Hadn't expected him to be curious about the ordinary architecture of my work life. The evenings were harder. We were inside, and there was only the sitting room with its fire, and whatever he was working on was spread on the low table, and I was sketching on my tablet, and we didn't talk much, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of two people maintaining careful distance. The silence of two people who had stopped needing to maintain it quite so hard and weren't sure what to do next. On the fourth night, he fell asleep in the armchair. I saw it happen, the slow lowering of his defenses, the way his hand with the document in it relaxed and the pages slid, the measured evenness of his face going truly quiet for the first time I had ever seen. He looked younger. He looked briefly like a person rather than a system. I should have woken him and told him to go to bed. I covered him with the throw blanket from the sofa instead, and then I went to bed and I lay in the Lakeview room and stared at the ceiling and let myself feel all the things I'd been managing at careful arm's length, and I was very thoroughly terrified by most of them. By the 6th day, I missed my friend. Her name was Maya. We had been friends since university. She'd studied journalism. I'd studied design. We'd shared a flat for 2 years and argued about washing up, and knew each other the way only people who have been truly inconvenient to each other can. When I married Julian, Maya had been the only person I'd told. And she had sat with me in my flat the night before the wedding and not tried to talk me out of it, just said, "You'll call me," with the ferocity of someone making a demand disguised as a statement. I had called her occasionally, carefully, from the estate phone that Julian's staff had told me, politely on my 3rd day in residence, was private and secure. Secure, I had understood, meaning monitored. So, I had eventually moved to calling from my mobile, which I had told myself was private, which I had mostly believed. I had not called Maya since the Blackwood move. There was something in the intensity of the relocation, the urgency of Rocco's sweeps, the careful window locks, Julian's watchfulness that had made me understand at a body level that something of it was genuinely wrong, and for 5 days I had been disciplined. On day 6, I broke. It was afternoon. Julian was in the back study doing whatever he did. Rocco had driven to town for supplies. Gino was at the perimeter. I was alone in the sitting room, and I was lonelier than I had allowed myself to acknowledge, and I was scared. Not the sharp, immediate kind, but the low, chronic kind that had been building since the garden gate and the cream envelope and all the things I hadn't told him. And I called Maya. She answered on the 2nd ring with Clara. "Oh my God, where are you?" I'm fine, I said too quickly. "I'm okay. I'm somewhere outside the city for a bit. I can't explain, but I'm fine." "You sound like you're not fine. I don't know. Things are complicated with him, with everything." I pressed my hand against my forehead. I tried to give him divorce papers and he tore them up. A long silence. He tore them into pieces. Clara. Maya's voice had a texture to it now. "That's either very romantic or very alarming." "I know. Which is it? I genuinely don't know. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the call timer on my screen, telling myself I would stop at 10, and then at 11, and then cutting it off myself, with a sharpness that surprised Maya because something had moved in the house. A door, a footstep, and I felt suddenly viscerally guilty in a way I couldn't articulate. I needn't have bothered cutting it off. The damage was already done. I wouldn't understand this for another 48 hours when Rocco came back from the perimeter, at 9 in the evening, with a different energy to him. And he spoke quietly to Julian in the kitchen, and I watched from the hallway as Julian went still in a way I had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness of his normal composure, but the specific stillness of a man receiving information that cost him. He turned and saw me. "Come in here," he said. I came in. Rocco left. The kitchen was quiet, the overhead light warm, the lake invisible through the dark window. Julian stood with his hands flat on the counter and looked at me, and I had never felt so clearly known by a look in my life. "Your phone call," he said. 2 days ago. How long did you speak?" Everything went cold. 11 minutes, I said. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Did you speak from inside this property?" "Yes." "From your mobile?" "Yes." He looked away to the window. "The Rosettas have a cell intercept network in this county. We knew about it. I should have taken your phone when we arrived." He exhaled once, controlled. "They have a triangulation from this cell zone." I felt sick. "They know where we are. They have a radius. They don't have the exact property yet." He looked back at me. "But they will within 12 hours. I didn't, Julian. I didn't think about it. I know. I just needed to hear someone. I just needed." I stopped. The word trusted had almost come out of my mouth, which would have been a small catastrophe given everything. "I know," he said again. Different this time. Less a judgment and more a weight he was carrying. "I know." I wanted to cry. I didn't because crying would have felt like making it about myself, and this was my mistake, and other people were going to pay for it. And that was a specific kind of horror that didn't reduce to tears. "What do we do?" I asked. "We move tomorrow at 5. Different property." He pushed off the counter and crossed to the doorway, and then he stopped. His back was to me. Next time you need to speak to someone, come to me first. I almost said, but you wouldn't understand. I almost said I needed someone who knows me. I almost said the truly honest thing, which was that the reason I had called Maya was because the things I was feeling about him had become too large to carry alone in this house, and I hadn't been able to go to him with them directly. I said none of that. Okay, I said. I will. He left. I stood in the kitchen for a very long time after, not crying, just feeling the specific texture of having made a mistake that had weight, real weight, the kind that falls on more than one person. I pressed my hands flat on the counter the way he had, and looked at the dark window, and thought about the cream envelope and the card and all the things I'd chosen not to hand over. And I understood that I had been managing information like it belonged only to me. And in this world, in this particular life I had agreed to, nothing worked that way. I went and knocked on the back study door. Yes, I opened the door. He was at the desk already making calls. He looked up. There's something else, I said. I told him about the card. He listened to all of it without interrupting. I told him about the garden gate, and the cream envelope, and the card with its neat patient text, and the white handkerchief invitation. And while I spoke, he leaned back in his chair and watched me the way. He watched everything with that complete undivided attention that was both studying and terrifying in equal measure. I told him I'd kept it, that I'd thought about it, that I hadn't put the handkerchief out, not because someone had talked me out of it, but because I hadn't wanted to. I told him that I was sorry I hadn't said so sooner, and I watched his face for anger. It didn't come. When I finished, he sat forward and looked at his hands for a moment. They've been cultivating a path out for you, he said. For weeks, yes. They wanted you afraid enough to use it. I nodded. He was quiet. Then the card, they wrote your first name. I noticed that. Someone who knows you gave them that. Someone who knows you're here as Clara, not as my wife. He looked up. It's probably someone from your life before. That was a different kind of sick. I thought of the small circle of people from before. Maya, 2 university friends, a colleague, people I trusted, people who had no context for what this information could be weaponized to do. I'll handle it, he said. Not threatening, just factual. What does that mean? It means I'll find out who spoke to them, and I'll make sure they don't do it again. He looked at me steadily. It won't be violent. They're civilians, but they'll be persuaded to let this particular association go. I believed him about the nonviolence. I'd learned enough by then to understand that Julian's world operated in scales, and people without power were treated differently from people with it. It wasn't mercy exactly. It was practicality. Civilians didn't have currency worth damaging. Okay, I said. He nodded once. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that was brief and quiet and in Italian, which I understood fragments of by that point. And whatever was on the other end said what he needed to hear. And he put the phone down. Go to bed, he said. We leave at 5. I turned to go. Clara, I stopped. You were right to tell me. A pause, both things. I went to bed. We moved at 5 to a property farther north, a converted farmhouse. Nothing like the manor, lower ceiling and older smelling, with a kitchen garden and a creaking staircase and windows that let in too much weather. Rocco was on edge, in a way he was usually very good at hiding, and Gino drove like someone who was watching the rear-view mirror rather than the road. And I sat in the back with Julian, and didn't speak, and felt the tension of the car like a second skin over my own. It was on the second night at the farmhouse that everything shifted. Someone had gotten close to the perimeter in the early morning hours. A scout, Rocco determined. Not an assault, but close enough. I heard them moving outside my window at 3 a.m, and sat up in bed with my heart detonating in my chest, and made myself breathe through it. And then Julian was at my door. Not knocking, already there, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been listening. And he came in and said, "It's handled," in that voice of his. And then he saw my face. I had caught my arm on the window latch when I'd startled awake. A shallow cut, nothing significant, but bleeding in that persistent dramatic way shallow cuts had. He crossed to me without a word and took my arm in his hands and looked at it with the focused, precise calm of someone assessing a problem. And then he went to the bathroom and came back with a cloth and antiseptic and sat on the edge of the bed beside me. He cleaned the cut. His hands were careful. The way everything he did was careful, deliberate, with nothing wasted. I watched his face while he worked, the concentration of it, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and I was so exhausted and so frightened and so grateful to have him beside me that I stopped trying to manage any of it and just sat there. "You should have woken me," he said quietly. I didn't want to. I stopped. I didn't want to need too much. His hand still on my arm. He looked up, and the distance that lived in his eyes, the careful managed gray sky distance, was simply gone. Just gone. And what was underneath it was not the composed professional man who ran a crime empire and spoken facts and tore up divorce papers, but something less armored than that. Something that had been looking at me for a very long time. "Clara," he said, just that. My name again, but carrying everything it had never carried before. I looked at him, and my hands were trembling. Not from the cold, not from the fright of the window. And I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted, or even entirely what I wanted. Only that the distance between us in that moment felt like the only wrong thing in a world full of wrong things. He reached up and touched my face slowly, his thumb along my cheekbone, like he was asking a question through his hands rather than his mouth. "Is this?" "I don't know how to." "You don't have to know how," he said very quietly. He leaned in slower than anything, like he was giving me every possible opportunity to stop it. And I didn't stop it. I couldn't stop it. I put my hand against his chest and felt his heart beating and said, "Barely, okay," which was not elegant or certain or bold, but it was true and it was mine. He kissed me the way he did everything, with complete unhurried attention. No urgency, no performance. Just the careful weight of someone who had been waiting a long time and had decided that rushing was the worst possible use of the moment. And I kissed him back, with everything that 13 months of carefully managed distance had turned into. All the confusion and the longing and the fear and the quiet gratitude. And it was messy and real, and nothing like the scripted kisses of the life I'd thought I was going to have. When we broke apart, neither of us spoke for a moment. My hand was still against his chest, his was still at my jaw, and the farmhouse was quiet around us. And somewhere outside, Rocco was walking the perimeter, and the world was what it was, dangerous and complicated, and not safe and never going to be safe. But in that room, in that moment, it was very still. "I've been afraid," I said, not sure what I was confessing. "I know." His thumb moved once slightly. "So have I." I looked at him. "You're not afraid of anything." "I was afraid," he said, "that you were going to leave." I held that, turned it over carefully, looked at the man who had torn the papers, and said, "I've already made it," and doubled the gate rotation and moved us to 3 different properties and told me quietly, 6 nights ago, I'm not leaving. And understood slowly that none of it had been management. "I wasn't going to leave," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "I know," he said. Now we sat on the edge of the bed, and the night sat around us, and the fire had burned down in the grate, and it was cold enough that eventually he reached for the blanket at the foot of the bed and pulled it around both of us, and we stayed like that. Just that, until the window turned gray with morning, and Rocco knocked on the door, and the world remembered itself. The attack came 3 days later. It came not at the farmhouse. By then, Julian had moved us again, a quick relay north to a safe flat in a coastal city, narrow streets, a building without a lobby, stairwell that smelled of salt and old stone. Rocco had said the farmhouse route was likely compromised. We'd left in the middle of the night. The flat was on the 4th floor. 2 rooms, a window overlooking a street too narrow for cars. I had stopped being surprised by the places we moved through, which told me something about how much had changed in me since the estate, since the marble floors and the guest suite, and the 13 months of careful maintenance. It was a Tuesday when it happened. Julian had left the flat that morning. He'd told me the night before that there was a meeting in the city he couldn't offer, something to do with the Sever situation, with the political contacts, who were apparently getting nervous about the Rossetti activity. He'd looked at me for a long moment before he left, and said Rocco would stay with me. And I'd said fine, and he'd left. And I had not let myself watch him go from the window, because I had told myself I wasn't the kind of woman who watched men leave from windows. I watched from the window. He disappeared into the narrow street, and I stayed at the glass for a while longer, watching the ordinary morning. A baker unloading from a van. A man walking a small dog. The unremarkable theater of a city going about its business. And I thought about how strange it was that I had lived inside something extraordinary for over a year. And the most frightening thing about it in that moment was a man walking away down a narrow street. The attack wasn't on me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The attack was on Julian. It came in the form of information first. Rocco's phone rang at 10, and whatever was on the other end of it took the color out of his face in a way I had never seen before. He turned away from me and spoke in rapid Italian that I couldn't follow. And then he was pulling on his jacket and calling Gino, and he turned to me and said, "Stay in this room. Do not open the door. Do not go near the windows," with a precision that told me the careful neutral was gone, and what was underneath it was something I should listen to. What happened? My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. There's been a situation with Julian's convoy. A pause. He was assessing how much to tell me. He's alive. I need to go to him. Alive. The word as reassurance is also the word that confirms the question. I pressed my hands together. Was he hurt? Rocco's face did something complicated. Go in the back room. Gino is on the door. He left. I went in the back room. I sat on the floor because the chair was too exposed to the window, and I'd remembered what he'd said once about elevation and sightlines in an offhand way that I hadn't understood was a lesson at the time. I sat on the floor with my back against the interior wall, and I thought about the word alive, and tried very hard to make it enough. The betrayal came out later. Not from an enemy, not from the Rosettas directly, from inside. A man named Aldo, who had been with Julian's organization for 4 years, who had been on the payroll, who had been trusted with certain routing information, had been selling position data to the Rosettas for 3 months. The convoy had been hit at a junction that only Aldo had known about. 2 men from the convoy were injured, one badly. Julian had a cut across his left forearm from broken glass, and a bruise along his ribs from the door of the car. And when Rocco brought him back to the flat that evening, I was in the kitchen, and I heard the door, and I came out and I saw him. He was upright, composed, blood dried on the sleeve of his jacket ruined, otherwise outwardly himself. But there was something in his eyes that I recognized because I had felt it on the farmhouse floor when I had understood that my phone call had cost us our location, the look of someone who had been failed by a decision they had made and was carrying the weight of what that cost. He saw me and stopped. You should sit down, I said. My voice was still surprisingly steady. Your arm needs cleaning. He looked at me for a moment. Then he came into the kitchen and sat at the table. And I got the first aid kit that Gino kept in the cabinet, and I cleaned the cut on his arm, the way he had cleaned mine on the farmhouse bed, and his sleeve was rolled up, and my hands were working, and neither of us spoke. Halfway through, I felt him watching my face. It wasn't your fault, he said. What happened today? I looked up. Aldo was in place before you called Maya. His voice was very even. The phone call narrowed a perimeter. This was already built. You don't have to. I'm not being kind, he said. I'm being accurate. You made one mistake. I made several. Aldo is mine. I held that for a moment, the acceptance of it. The way he took responsibility without theater, without self-flagellation, just as a statement of what was true. And I thought, this is what it looks like when competence costs emotional peace. It costs it quietly with a cut arm and dried blood on a ruined jacket, sitting in a kitchen in a coastal city, while someone who shouldn't love you tends to you. I finished cleaning the cut. I put the bandage on carefully. I left my hand on his arm after. Not intentionally, just I didn't move it. And he looked down at my hand and then up at my face. And something passed between us that was not romantic, not exactly, but was more intimate than anything that had come before. Because it was just true, just real, without distance or management, or the careful architecture of people who haven't decided yet. What happens to Aldo? I asked. A beat. He's already handled. I nodded. I thought about asking what that meant. I decided not to. Not because I was naive. I had long since stopped managing my naivety about this world, but because there are things you carry the knowledge of and things you don't, and I was choosing carefully now about what I picked up. Julian, I looked at him. Is it over? The Rosettas? Not yet. He turned his hand over on the table, his palm up, and I realized he was waiting for me to decide whether to take it. Soon, I put my hand in his. He gave me a choice. 3 days after Aldo, when the immediate aftermath had settled into the particular quiet that follows violence. Not peace exactly. More like the world holding its breath. Julian called me into the back room, where he'd been working, and he sat across from me with his hands on the table, and he told me what he'd arranged. A new identity, clean documents, a flat in a city in the north of France, that he had already purchased, furnished, set up with a 3-year financial cushion, a contact person, not connected to any family or network, someone who would check in monthly, a life modest and specific that I could disappear into, and never be reached. This is still on the table, he said. It doesn't close because of what happened between us. You need to know that it's still a real option. I looked at him. The cut on his arm was 3 days old now, beginning to close. The bruise on his ribs I hadn't seen but knew was there. He was composed and forward-facing, and was offering the door with a kind of steadiness that cost him something. I could see it costing him in the slight tightening around his jaw, in the way his hands lay very deliberately flat and still. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you came into this marriage for a reason that had nothing to do with love, and you should leave it, or stay in it for a reason that has nothing to do with fear. I was quiet for a long time. I thought about the France flat. I could picture it easily. I had an artist's imagination for interiors. Small, probably, good light, close to a market, a life that was mine alone, without marble floors or men who spoke Italian in corridors at 2 a.m, without the particular terror of watching someone important to you, come through a door with blood on their jacket. It would be safe. It would be quiet. It would also be, I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, profoundly empty. "What do you want?" I asked. Something moved in his face. He wasn't expecting that. "What I want is not the relevant variable. It is to me." A pause. The longest pause he had ever given anything. "I want you to stay," he said. "Quiet. Simple, but I want you to stay because you chose to. Not because you didn't know there was another option." I stood up. He watched me. I walked to the door, which was the logical direction, and I got my coat from the rack and I put it on, and I went downstairs and outside into the salt-cold air of the street, and I walked. Gino materialized behind me, at a distance which I expected. And I didn't acknowledge it. And I walked for 20 minutes down the narrow streets, with the sound of the sea somewhere close and the cold on my face, and the France flat very clear in my imagination. I got to the car at the end of the street, the one Rocco had pointed out that morning as the departure vehicle if needed. I stood beside it. I stood there for 4 minutes, maybe 5. I thought about the garden of the estate in the early morning, how it smelled before the day started. I thought about the armchair, the throw blanket, the way he'd fallen asleep with the documents in his hand. I thought about his voice saying, "So have I," in the dark of the farmhouse. I thought about the word alive, and what it had done to me when Rocco said it. I thought about a life in France with good light and a market nearby, and an emptiness I could feel right now from this street, like a room with no furniture. I turned around. Gino was behind me at the distance, hands in pockets, face patient and carefully non-expressive. He had the look of a man who had been in this situation before, waiting to see what women in important situations decided. I walked back up the stairs down the narrow hall. I opened the door to the back room and Julian was at the window, not working. Just standing there, and he turned when I came in. I took off my coat. "France is not for me," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Something in him, something held very carefully, and for a very long time came undone. Quietly, the way snow comes off a roof, when the temperature shifts a single degree. He crossed the room and he pulled me against him, and his arms were very tight around me, which was not his usual careful measured restraint, and his face was against the top of my head, and I pressed my hands flat against his back and held on, and we didn't speak. And neither of us made it anything other than what it was. We stood there for a long time. "You're not going to make this easy," I said eventually into his shirt. "No." I could feel him almost smiling. "Probably not." "Good," I breathed. Easy was boring. The Rossetti situation ended in the last week of the following month. I wasn't there for the ending. I wasn't meant to be, and I didn't ask to be, which was its own kind of growth. The understanding that there are parts of this life that operate outside my visibility, and that choosing to love someone in it means choosing to trust what you can't see. Julian was gone for 48 hours. Rocco with him. Gino stayed with me in the coastal flat, and I worked on my design project and cooked because it gave my hands something to do, and I waited. He came back on a Tuesday morning. No blood this time, just tired in a way he rarely let show. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and I sat across from him, and neither of us rushed. "It's done," he said. "The Rossettis won't be moving against this family again. There are arrangements in place that they'll respect." I thought about what arrangements meant in his language. I had stopped requiring this knowledge translated. "And the person who gave them my name?" I asked. "The one from my old life who had handed a detail to the wrong people. A woman you knew from university, Jenna." He looked at me. She was paid. She didn't understand the full picture of what she was facilitating. A pause. "She does now. She'll leave it alone." I thought of Jenna briefly, a face from a lecture hall, a person I'd known in passing, who had apparently sold a small thread of my life for reasons I would never fully know. I sat with the feeling. It was sadder than I expected, less angry than it might have been earlier. "Thank you," I said, "for not." "She wasn't the threat," he said. "She was used as one. That's a different thing." I nodded. I looked at my coffee. "I want to call Maya. I'll set up a secure line, no hesitation. You can speak to her properly." I looked up. He was watching me with that particular quality of attention that I had spent 13 months not understanding, and now understood too well to pretend otherwise. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The night I brought the papers." I paused. "You already knew about the Rossettis. You already knew they were building something. Why didn't you just tell me? Come to me and say stay, here's why." You tore them up and pulled me back and said, don't. You didn't explain. He was quiet for a moment, set his coffee cup down. I didn't want to keep you, he said, because you were afraid to leave. I wanted you to know that you could go and still choose not to. He looked at me steadily. I needed to know you weren't staying out of obligation or debt, or because my name was dangerous enough to make leaving feel impossible. And if I had left, I asked. If I'd called the number on that card, a beat, I would have let you. He said it with difficulty, which was a kind of difficulty I hadn't seen before. Not the controlled management of a man handling a threat, but something more fundamental, more private. I would have been very angry about it, he said. But I would have let you. I thought about that. I thought about him standing at a window somewhere, knowing I had chosen the France flat, and the good light and the market. I thought about what that would have cost him. I thought about myself standing beside that car in the salt-cold street, and the 4 minutes I'd spent choosing. That was a terrible plan, I said. Something shifted in his face, a softening so brief and so complete that if I hadn't been watching I would have missed it. Yes, he said, in retrospect. I reached across the table and touched his hand, just that. Palm over the back of his hand, fingers against his fingers. He turned his hand over and held mine. We sat with our coffee in the morning light coming in gray through the narrow window, the kind of light that didn't promise anything particular about the day, but was honest about what it was, and we didn't need to say anything more. This is the part where I try to tell you that everything was resolved and clean, that the world outside became safe, that the weight of what he was and what his life required and what it would always require simply lifted and settled into a fairy tale. I could tell you that it wouldn't be true. What was true was this. We went back to the estate 3 weeks later. The marble floors were the same. The ceilings were the same. The long corridors and the high chandeliers, and the study with the good Persian rug, all the same. But I walked differently in them. I had the east garden room now, the one with the better light, and the view of the old oak. And the guest suite was being redesigned for something else, which had been Julian's instruction, and had been delivered to the interior contractor while I was standing beside him in the hall, which was his way of saying things he didn't make speeches about. Maya visited on a Saturday. She arrived in a car that Gino drove, which she found extremely funny, and she sat in the kitchen and drank tea, and looked around the estate with the specific expression of someone cataloging an enormous amount of information for later use. And then she looked at me and said quietly, "You're okay." "Yes," I said. "You look different. Probably." She leaned forward. Good, different. I thought about everything that had happened between the night I walked into the study with those papers, and the Tuesday morning kitchen, and the hand across the table. I thought about the farmhouse, and the France flat, and the salt-cold street. I thought about the woman who had practiced in the mirror quietly. "I'm setting you free," not knowing that the act of trying to free someone could be its own kind of declaration, and not knowing that he would hear it as one. "Yes," I said. "Good, different." Julian passed through the kitchen doorway, midway through the afternoon, and did the brief calibrated courtesy of introducing himself properly to Maya, which she received with excellent composure, and eyes that were absolutely taking everything apart. And then he looked at me across the room in a way that was quiet and complete and only mine and left. Maya watched him go. Then she looked at me. "Oh," she said simply. "I know," I said. "I know." She held her tea. "Are you safe?" I thought about the question properly, the way it deserved. I thought about what safe meant in a world where danger had a name and address and schedule. I thought about what safe meant when the person you love carries a world on their shoulders that could, on any given Tuesday, arrive with blood on their sleeve. I thought about all the things that were still true, the risks, the permanence of his world, the fact that peace in this life was always provisional, always earned, never simply given. "Not always," I said. "Not guaranteed." She nodded. "But yes," I said. Mostly in the ways that matter. She seemed to accept that. She was a journalist. She understood that honest answers were rarely symmetrical. That evening after Maya had gone, I found Julian in the study again. It was late. The house was quiet. The light was under the door the way it always was. I knocked twice, out of habit now, not hesitation, and came in. He was at his desk. He looked up. I crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, the one I had ever sat in before, the one that was for meetings and conversations that mattered. And I put my feet on the edge of his desk in a way that was an absolute breach of the formality that desk was designed for. And he looked at my feet. And then he looked at me, and something in his expression was so close to amuse that I felt it like warmth all the way down. "You're staying," he said. Again, not a question. a statement that was also, quietly, a miracle he was still getting used to. "I'm staying," I said, confirmed it, let it be final. He reached over unhurried as everything and wrapped his hand around my ankle. Not possessive, not a demonstration. Just present, just there. Outside the estate was quiet. Somewhere the old oak in the garden was doing what trees did, breathing in the dark, putting down roots, existing in the patient way of things that have decided where they belong. The night was long, and the world was not simple, and the life I had walked into on a gray November morning was not going to become simple just because I had chosen it. But there was his hand at my ankle, and his eyes in the lamplight, and the torn pieces of an old envelope long since gone, and in the quiet of the study, I sat across from him and let the last of the careful distance dissolve finally into something truer and less armored and entirely my own. I had walked into this room trying to set him free. He had torn the papers. He had pulled me close, and I had stayed. Not because the world was safe. Not because love makes things clean or easy or without consequence, but because the alternative, the good light, the France flat, the emptiness I had felt standing beside a car on a salt-cold street, was not living.